I'm David Rudman. I'm a senior fellow here at the Center for Global Development, and it's really great to see this big crowd. This has to be one of the largest we've had for a book event, if not the largest. I think I have a very easy job today because the set of ideas that will be represented, I expect, today have really taken economics and development by storm, so I don't need to introduce them really. And I suspect a lot of you already know who Dean is, and I don't really think I need to introduce him. I could try to introduce his co-author, Jacob Appel. However, contrary to the bio, he is not actually an ethicist and fiction writer, and so on. So he will explain that at greater length. The tagline here, I've got it right here so I don't get it wrong. The tagline for the Center for Global Development is independent research and practical ideas for global prosperity. And it's hard for me to think of a set of ideas, a book, a set of authors who are more in our sweet spot than what we're about to see. We are very committed to the value of rigorous research in order to that will inform good policy making in order to make prosperity more global. We are not active. We don't do our own randomized experiments. We are not behavioral economists, but we are very eager consumers of that work and very interested in it. Myself, I come at this from a particular unusual angle. I've spent probably more time than I should looking at and shaking and examining non-randomized studies of the impact of microcredit, the impact of foreign aid on economic growth, and have generally come to the conclusion that, yeah, there are correlations, but what's causing what is much less clear. And so having had that rather intense experience of even some disillusionment with the non-randomized work, I appreciate the value of randomized trials all the more, although I'm also interested in its limitations, and I expect that will come up in the discussion. So what we're going to do is we're going to have, I think, about 20 minutes from Dean, and then roughly another 10 minutes from Jake, and then we're going to have a discussion panel, which I will introduce you at that time.
Great. Thank you so much, David, and thank you everyone here for coming, and to the CGD community for hosting us. So we're really excited to be having this conversation with everybody here, and I want to also thank all the panelists for coming and sharing their time and insights with us. So sometimes I'm going to explain a few things about the way we often talk about this work to the community outside development, because I think it helps understand a little bit of where we're coming from. So a lot of times when I've been in conversations about this book over the past year or two with individuals who are outside, they ask, okay, so I get it. This is about that debate that I've heard between Sachs and Easterly, does aid work? So which camp are you in? Right? And my answer to that is always so boring and mediocre, and that it's impossible to argue with, which is to say that we're in the middle. That the answer is that some things work and some things don't. Right? Now, I mean, that's just such a reasonable thing to say that it's hard to argue with that. But, and obviously that's not the end of the story. That's not where we stop, right? We're not saying, so it's just 50-50 chance, and so go and try things, and sometimes you'll get lucky and sometimes not, right? It's obviously more than that. And in some sense, in a very simplistic way, that's what this is all about. That's what this whole movement is that we've seen take over in the world of development economics in the past 10 to 15 years, is this search for the patterns, this search for the evidence, right? And the recognition is that we have to not go from the sky, that we're not going to compare the total volume of aid that goes to Nigeria and compare that to Chad and compare that to Angola and to Cambodia, and then draw conclusions about whether aid works. And that's just not going to get us there. That instead we got to go to the ground. And that's in some sense what this is all about. Now, the second thing this is all about is a particular way of going to the ground. And I'm going to just give a perhaps extreme example, and I hope you appreciate this and take it with how it's intended, which is one of flattery, although some of it you'll see. So, when you in the space of microcredit, which I'm going to talk more about, there was an old paper from 1998 done using some fairly advanced econometric techniques. So this was a project which did go to the ground, quote unquote. Now, this project was subsequently restudied by another researcher with the same data, drew very different conclusions. It was very hard. I remember when I was in graduate school, having a task of going through those two papers to try to figure out what the deal was. I'll admit, I didn't conclude, like, there were some details there that I was just like, not so sure about. Not so sure what this step is doing in this one paper. I did have a general inkling that I was concerned about an overall question about identification, but it was not, you know, I didn't even occur to me to try to write a paper that tried going back to this. David did, and there's, you know, I think two things about that strike me. One is one of admiration. I mean, he really tackled it in a way that dug in and actually made some points clear that I think were not clear to the rest of the world who were consumers of that like me beforehand. So I admired him a lot for figuring some of those things out and distilling them to people like me who were aware of the debate but didn't go through the details. The other part, which is the tongue-in-cheek part, which is I also read his detailed diatribe on the, you know, and I kind of wondered, what were you thinking? Like, let's just randomize this thing and get to the answer that way. Because, you know, are we really going to solve this by having these highfalutin econometric debates about these different estimators and these different issues, and this issue about identification? And there's one really brute force way that we know we can pull it off. And it's not to say that all things can be done that way. Okay, and that's one key point that hopefully is clear. If there's anybody who ever, if there's no one who does randomized trials that I've ever met who has ever said all things can be randomized in order to evaluate. Okay, so if you ever hear someone saying that, it's just that they're being sloppy. But I honestly have never heard someone really in the space of doing that claims that. The only times I've heard that claim made is from criticisms of what those of us who are doing them do them. And those people should just be slapped for misrepresenting what we're doing and what we're claiming. Because that's crazy, right? There are many questions out there that are good questions, that are important questions, that are not approachable using this type of technique. The one thing that we have recognized, though, is that there's a lot of questions that you might have thought were off the table, but that actually aren't. And that's where we have seen a lot of pushing of the envelope to push out and extend into areas that might have seemed like they weren't that viable. But in fact, where there was a will, there was a way to pull it off. But clearly there are some things off the table. You're not going to go randomize monetary policy. Okay, so the book is very much an introduction to understanding how we go about thinking about evaluation in development. And one of the things that we'll do, Jake will come up as my co-author, and we'll share with you and do a bit of a reading from the book to share with you one piece. But I think it helps understand how we became partners in this too, to understand a little bit about who the book's for and what the audience is for. So the book came about after I got a Google alert on innovations for poverty action, which I'll kind of briefly summarize in just a moment. But and this was a Google alert from a blog. Jake has been working for me for a little bit in Ghana, managing a study on interest rate sensitivity in the microcredit world. And the blog post was a story of his experience that day or some point that week, of someone he met in a local market or a taxi driver. I forget exactly which story it was. But it was a story of someone from Ghana that he had met and he had spent a lot of time interacting with and having a conversation about. And it was a very engaging story. And it was there were two things that really struck me when I read that story. One was, Jake was not, sometimes there are RAs who go out in the field and they go to the office and they go home and they hang out with expats and they go back to the office and they kind of do their thing, but they're not getting kind of engrossed into local communities and having they ride a taxi and they just ride the taxi. They don't ride the taxi and sit there with a 45-minute conversation with the taxi driver. Jake wasn't one of those people. He was the type of person who has the 45-minute conversation with the taxi driver. And the second was he was really good about writing about it, in a way that even people who know me well get this joke when I say that, not only did I start reading his blog, but I actually finished it, which is quite remarkable given my attention span. So I knew that the audience we wanted to reach for this was going to be an audience that was not reading the academic papers, and was not going to read the academic papers. My mother has never made it through a single one of my academic papers. And I would wanted a book that reached out to people like my mother. But it's beyond that too. It's not just, there's clearly a group within the development community too that has not been on the frontier doing this type of evaluation. And this book, we hope, introduces what it means to do this type of research, but does it by bringing in anecdotes and stories from the field, from individuals who are either part of studies or part of similar studies or dealing with similar problems, to help explain, given the richness of this person's life and what's happening, this is how a particular program or a particular idea might influence their life. So that's kind of the spirit of what the book is trying to do. And the book is going, now the second, and I'm going to talk a little bit about IPA and explain where the book fits into that, and then talk about one of the key areas that the book talks a lot about in the space of microcredit and some of the policy implications and prescriptions that come out of the book and the thinking on there. So simply put, Innovations for Poverty Action has two parts to it: the production of knowledge and the getting the knowledge into the right hands. Right? I'm not going to go into length. I think a lot of people here are familiar, and if you're not, we're happy to talk with you. And actually, there's many people from IPA that are here, and so if you want to find out more, please come find us. The production of the knowledge has been going on for a long time. The getting within IPA, that's how we kind of got our start, and that's how we have our growth. We're now in 46 countries and almost 500 employees, about 250 of which are kind of research assistant types living overseas. Now, the getting that information into the hands of the right people is a separate task. It's related, obviously. And that's about getting the information in the hands of organizations and getting the information in the hands of donors. Where do donors go if they have $50 million? Well, they have lots of places to go. They can call up the people who did the research. They can commission the research, right? If you have $50,000, where do you go? If you have $50, where do you go? That's not so easy. And that's a big part of where we need to make huge inroads. There's a lot of money that is spent in that zone. And how can we help make that money be spent more effectively? And that's a big part of what we're trying to do at IPA, is get that information into those hands. And so that's another theme of the book. Okay, so what are some of the prescriptions? So let's talk about microcredit. So microcredit is one of the things that I think simply put, microcredit has been its own worst enemy. And it's been its own worst enemy because it has such a compelling story. And it's such a uniform story across political sides. So the one thing that's striking to me is how often microcredit is touted. Going back to how I started the conversation, the Saxon Easterly camp, I hear microcredit touted by both sides in that camp as a good thing, right? And that can tell you a lot about why it'd be so easy to raise money for it and so easy to do it. So the Sax camp likes it in the sense that it's along with a long list of other things that are doing things to promote poverty. In Dambisa Moyo's interviews when her Dead Aid book came out, it was a whole bunch of negativity. This is broken, that's broken. And I'll never forget the one interview I read of her, I believe in Time magazine, I could be wrong exactly where, it said, okay, what's the one punchline you should do? Answer, one word, microcredit. And I read that and I was just like, wait a second. Okay, so I understand why you're negative. I'm not as negative as you are, but I understand your logic and all this, but what made you all of a sudden flip from all of that negativity to being so positive on something where you didn't have any evidence to be positive? Right, because we can easily be negative, and if we look at microcredit in America, it's called microdebt, and it's something we're trying to get people out of. So we just have to flip the word from credit to debt, and all of a sudden it becomes bad, right? And so this was really striking to me that we took this one concept, which actually has a genuine debate to it, and all of a sudden put all our eggs into there. Now, so the point is, there's been huge rhetoric and huge enthusiasm and huge support for this idea as if it's a silver bullet. Now, as with anything, again, this is one of those things where when you say it, it's kind of hard to argue that there's no silver bullet, right? When you say it in a moment of seriousness. And so, of course, when the rigorous evaluation started coming out of microcredit and didn't show that it was saving the world and saving poverty, this was seen as a huge disappointment, and that was just a shame. There was nothing that frustrated us more than when our studies came out about microcredit showing that it did not single-handedly lift people out of poverty, that this was actually seen as a bad thing and a sign that microcredit was bad, and that was not. And actually, the results, we all saw them when we looked at the data as being more or less on the good side, just not saving poverty kind of side, right? But there were still some clear benefits and some clear lessons that we were learning. The one thing that was striking, I thought, was when you do look at the all-in measure of the simplistic measure of poverty, that the actual biggest point estimate for the impact on poverty came not from the two programs that were evaluated that were more typically labeled microcredit, that were lending to entrepreneurs, but instead from the microcredit program in South Africa that was lending to salaried individuals for consumer credit at 200% annual interest rates. It was more like payday lending. And for what it's worth, even though this doesn't look and smell as much like microcredit that we kind of think of when we look at the brochures from Kiva and whatnot, that was actually where the impact on income was highest. Now, I'm not saying that we should go all in and support that, but it really begs the point that we need to know why something is working in order to then think about what to do. Right? Because they definitely don't say, okay, fine, let's just lend it 200% and that was the answer. Right? That would be kind of a silly prescription to come out of that. So the two lessons that I think have come out of these studies so far, there's been one in the Philippines, one in India, and this earlier one in South Africa. Our first is that we need to rid ourselves of this idea that microcredit is about entrepreneurship. And it's not to say that it's not about entrepreneurship, but we shouldn't define it that way. Now, why has it historically been defined as entrepreneurship, I think is something that's insightful, and because it's not the right reason. I could be wrong about this. It's not like I talked to the person who first started the brochures and why they stuck that word in there. But my hunch is that it was put in there because it sells, because entrepreneurship is sexy. You ask people in America, do you want to be an entrepreneur? And that's a good thing. A serial entrepreneur is even better, right? Which sometimes means serial failure, but still is considered good as long as you do it more than once, right? But this is a good thing. This is sexy in America, right? But in most developing countries that I've been to, and I'm not saying 100%, but for the most part, when I look at the people who are receiving credit from and there are micro entrepreneurs, this is not sexy. This is called I don't have a job. Okay. Now, it's not to say there's going to be clearly some situations that I don't doubt that they might actually prefer that to a job. I'm not saying this is like universal, but for the most part, this is not, it's not about entrepreneurship in that sense. It's and we shouldn't just be thinking about microcredit as serving that one single purpose. And in fact, some of the main benefits that we've seen out of microcredit have been outside of the entrepreneurship space. Okay, so in India, we did see increase in investment in the business. In the Philippines, we did not. In the Philippines, we actually saw a risk mitigation. We saw a reduction in the number of businesses, a consolidation. And we saw a replacement of insurance for when they got access to microcredit, and an increase in their ability to access credit from others in their community. So it was a sign that the credit was actually serving almost like an insurance device. Same in South Africa. What was the mechanism for increasing income? It was people were more likely to still be employed a year later. So this means is there was something happening in their life. They needed access to credit. If they didn't get that access to credit, they lose their job, right? This is now looking and smelling more like insurance to me, not right. And so then this is the second point of the takeaway that I have in terms of the direction we're going in the world of microfinance, which is to say, I don't think these products are actually servicing the needs that the people really have. That I think we need to think harder about what the demand side of the formula for the microfinance to understand better what do they really need. And then we need to think about how to design those products. And that might be about different credit, but for instance, more flexible credit products. So one other stylized fact, which is always striking to me and should be inspiring to anybody thinking about credit design, is how often people borrow from both microcredit and a money lender. Why is that? Why isn't the microcredit organization satisfying their credit need and they're still turning to the much higher interest rate lending from the money lender? Well, probably because the money lender is offering them something they still want. What is that? Why isn't the microcredit organization at its lower cost structure offering that same service? Well, let's find out. And a lot of times that answer we find, at least anecdotally, is about flexibility, which is what's pushed us in that direction to try to understand more about flexible product designs for microcredit. Similarly, this point about risk. What does that tell you? Well, if I have a risk in my life, the first thing I think about is, well, let's insure it, right? I drive. There's a risk of my car getting wrecked. I get car insurance. I fly, I travel, I drive, I have a risk of dying. What do? I get life insurance, right? So what about insurance? And lo and behold, we are seeing some really important impacts from some of the insurance programs we're seeing. One study it's not in the book, that's still not even written yet, which we're working on in Ghana, for instance, where we handed farmers either capital or free rainfall insurance or both. And what we're finding is that even if we just hand them free rainfall insurance without any capital, that they increase their investment in the farm. And if we hand them just capital, we actually don't see as much investment in the farm. That tells us that they're risk constrained. They're not capital constrained, at least in that context. So that study is still ongoing. But the overall lesson then, the second main takeaway, the first was, let's not necessarily think about microcredit as a tool for entrepreneurship. Let's think about it as a tool to expand the choices of the poor and the middle income, and accept the fact that some of those choices that we're giving them that they didn't have before might be like accelerating consumption. Is that so bad? Or it might be investing in education or health. That's good. Right? So we need to expand the set of things that we're immediately thinking they're using the money for, and get out of this idea that it's only to help grow businesses, make them bigger, turn the zero employee enterprise into something big, and that's just not the realistic model. But yet there are other things that we need to pay attention to. And then the second thing is, can we build a better mousetrap? What are the better products and services within microfinance that we can and should be thinking about? Where should we be pushing out on savings as well? Savings, insurance, as well as credit. So that's some of the main takeaways from the policy kind of prescription side that we do talk about in some of the book, and is also very much what's leading our charge at IPA in terms of helping us think about the future research that we're pushing towards doing. Is very, very focused on the savings side, on flexible credit side, and on insurance. And that's where we're forging ahead in terms of the impact we're trying to make over the next 5 to 10 years based on the lessons that we've learned so far. Okay, so with that, I'd like to turn the podium over to Jacob Appel, who is going to tell you a little bit more about the book.
Thanks, Dean. First, if I may, I'd like to make some small corrections here. So I wish I could take credit for having all these really impressive degrees. I actually see this guy all the time because I now have a Google alert for my own name, thinking that I would get relevant information about the book. But I always just hear what this guy's doing, and he's a really impressive guy, to be fair. Unfortunately, I guess he's a contrarian, or just like a rabble rouser. So the last article that he actually published was a defense of bestiality. So that's serious. You can look him up. So yeah, I wish that he would just publish more normal things. But anyway, a very, very short version of my bio is that I went to Columbia and studied math as an undergraduate, and then I went shortly thereafter to work for IPA in Ghana as a research assistant. Spent about 2 years there. And then Dean approached me with this idea of working on a book together. So he really offered me a dream job where I got to go around to a lot of IPAs and other organizations' project sites, do some work on the field, meet people and interview them and talk to them firsthand, and come up with some of the sort of human interest stories that are woven into the book. And then also to do some of the reading of papers and sharing the writing as well. So that was fun, and that brings me to this podium. So I want to talk about two things mainly. One is talking about another major theme of the book, and then I want to say a little bit about what we hope to achieve with this book and the message that we want to give to the audience. So first, let me just jump off from what Dean said. Build a better mousetrap. That's part of the policy takeaway in microfinance, and more broadly, program design, building better mousetraps, is something we talk about quite a lot in the book. And some of the insights into how to design better programs and better interventions really come from plain vanilla economics. They're sort of standard interpretations. We need to decrease the cost of access to a savings account. We need to drive down the cost of immunizations or of attending school, things like that, which are just standard neoclassical economics, but which can have huge impacts on people's lives. So those are great. And then there's another kind of set of insights which comes more from the behavioral economics side. I'm sure many of the people in this room know about behavioral economics as a intersection of kind of behavioral psychology and then economics, or more plainly is trying to expand the traditional model to incorporate the ways that we think that are not robotic and purely objective. So, for example, behavioral economics has taught us a lot about how to deal with temptation, which we see both in the developing world and in the developed world. So we have some insights that helped us design much better programs in the developing world using some commitment devices to overcome these temptation problems. I'll give two quick examples. One is what's called the Savings and Fertilizer Initiative from Western Kenya. So that's where at the end of a growing season, farmers sell their crop, and then they have, the flush with cash. And they know that next season they'd like to buy some fertilizer because they know it's going to result in higher crop yield and more profit. But there are some months between this season's harvest and next season's planting, and during those months the money somehow disappears out of their pockets. So the intervention, the insight there was, let's give them a commitment device. And so researchers went in with coupons, and so right when farmers harvested this season's crop, they were given the opportunity to lock in a fertilizer purchase for next season at the same price, no discount, but just the mere fact of offering it at the right time drove up take up about 50%. So that was a huge impact on actual usage just by getting the timing right. Another example is from the Philippines, where has anyone heard of the CARES program? CARES to quit smoking. So here's something that surprised quite a lot of people, that the poor generally, these were sort of poor clients of actually just poor smokers in the Philippines, were approached with an offer. How about, instead of spending money on cigarettes, you put that money into a savings account, and at the end of 6 months we'll test you, just take a urine test for nicotine, and if you've in fact stopped smoking, then you get all the money that you've saved that you would have otherwise spent on cigarettes. If you fail the test, if you have still been smoking, we're going to give that money away to a local orphanage. So again, these are in general poor clients, people who you wouldn't expect to have a ton of money to save, but people did sign up for this commitment account, and what the people who were merely offered the account were 33 percentage points. Tell me. Okay, so people were more likely to quit smoking merely by being offered this account, even though not everyone signed up, right? And so that is kind of an example of how these commitment devices are helping to shape products and interventions in the developing world. What's exciting to write about, what a lot of people have responded to in other talks we've done about the book, is that these same exact insights can be applied to our own lives as well. So we have a variety of commitment devices, the Save More Tomorrow program to stimulate savings for retirement, Stick.com, which Dean founded, which allows individuals to make commitment contracts to achieve their own goals. So if you want to quit smoking or lose weight, you can put your own money on the line and commit yourself to certain behaviors. So the sort of takeaway there is that from this behavioral side, we get some more universal insights about human behavior that can apply both to us here at home and to the programs that we're shaping abroad. So that's kind of that theme of the book. And then the second thing I'd like to talk about is the message that we're trying to get across with this book. As Dean mentioned, this is a book I hope that everybody in this room could learn something from, but it's really targeted at Dean's mom. So, and people like Dean's mom. And at some level, we kind of recognize that that people who don't live and breathe, this research and this kind of universe of development, they're really inundated with a ton of information, and it's hard to sort through. Appeals arrive in the mail. You see commercials on TV. You go to Kiva, whatever. There are so many voices crying out for our attention and our donations, and the charities that are doing that are really savvy. They understand behavioral economics too, and they know what pushes us and what we find compelling. So that's why we often find glossy brochures with really sad pictures of fly-bitten babies and distended bellies. That's why we find sponsor a child programs where you get a face and a name to go along with a particular story, and you know that your $30 is impacting that one child's life. And similarly, David did a lot to nudge Kiva in the right direction on disclosing their model. So in Kiva, as many of you know, you go on the site and you see a picture and a little write-up. This is such and such a person, and you're going to fund their loan by clicking now. In fact, the picture's a little more complicated, and so David did a lot to promote transparency there. And we see the book as kind of following in that path. So amid this flood of information, how can we make sure the right stuff gets through? And it is a challenge because charities make it very, very easy and painless and immediate to donate. So if you shop at Whole Foods, you're on the checkout line and you can give $1 to the Whole Planet Foundation or $5. And they know the same kind of behavioral insight, that it's easier to give $1 or $5 when you're already spending $100 on groceries, and giving that $5 allows you to walk out, full of grocery bags thinking, hey, I did something really good for the world right now at the checkout. They know that's an appetizing way to give, and so it's been very successful. It's raised millions of dollars. Another example, which I'll read from the book, sometimes giving can be a little too easy. So that happened in the case of Kara. Now, I'll read about her. Giving by text message takes a few seconds and is utterly gratifying. You type in Haiti, press send, and get an instant response thanking you for your generosity. You hardly have time to think of the phone bill coming at the end of the month, and when it does arrive, your $10 is easier to part with because it's already tacked on to the cost of phone service, a cost you're prepared to bear. Unless, that is, you are Kara. The following was pulled from a real Facebook page. Kara's profile said, I've texted Haiti to 90999 over 200 times. That's over $2,000 donated to Haiti relief efforts. Join me. And below her status update, there were some comments from friends. Noah said, your parents might not like your cell phone bill this month. Kara said, it's not my money. Ha! Wait a second. This doesn't just get added to the phone bill, does it? I thought it was just a free thing. Kara, shoot, no, every text is $10. She said, wow, are you sure? This could be very bad for me. Her friend said, yeah, I saw it on the football game. They bill it to your cell phone bill. Every text is $10. It said so when the Health and Human Services lady came on and told people about it on the Colbert Report. Maybe you should ask people to help you pay for your phone bill? Kara said, thanks for letting me know. Haha, Haiti must love me. So that's kind of an extreme example, but it is a relevant example where giving becomes so easy and effortless and immediate that you don't think very hard before you do it. Now, to be clear, Kara's mistake, a $2,000 mistake in favor of Haiti and of the Red Cross efforts in Haiti, is not a really big mistake. It's kind of good. But in the big picture, we can do better than that. We can do better than giving mindlessly and just immediately. We can try to think a little bit more critically and proactively about who and how and where we give. And so what Dean and I hope is that this book helps to promote that kind of critical thinking. So that's why we did it. So I think now we have a panel of discussants coming up. David will describe. Thanks.
At least something to read. Great. I'd like to invite our panelists up, and I will briefly introduce them. They can introduce themselves more as necessary. All three are, I would describe, as practitioners. They work at the intersection of policy and actually trying to run public or private aid programs that make a difference. We will hear first, I think, yes, from Carola Alvarez, who is currently the chief of the Office of Strategic Planning and Development Effectiveness at the Inter-American Development Bank. And her bio is a little bit vague. Towards the end, it says she has worked in developing rigorous impact evaluation and providing technical assistance to ministries in El Salvador and the Dominican Republic, and several programs in Mexico, including Oportunidades, which is a famous program I think now called Progressa. Whether around this is a new name. Sorry, but that's sort of the emblematic example of randomization being built into a pilot of a program and then being used to propagate an idea very effectively to other countries. I mentioned the vagueness because I suspect she played an important role in there, and she has to be diplomatic about describing it. I don't know, just a guess. And then we also have Frank Wiebe, if I'm saying it right, who is currently chief economist at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and in that role has to think about what economics tells us about how to do a better job at the MCC. Before that, he had a similar position, chief economist and director of economic reform and development programs at the Asia Foundation. And last, we have Ruth Levine, who is now just properly described as the incoming director for global development of the Global Development and Population Program at the Hewlett Foundation, which means she's in the midst of moving to California. She just finished up, about a year and a half as the Deputy Assistant Administrator at USAID in the Bureau of Policy, Planning, and Learning. And before she took that job, I said, so does this mean you're going to try to make USAID into a learning organization? And she said, yes. And of course, before that, she spent many years at CGD, I guess about 8 years, doing all sorts of important work, including co-authoring a report called When Will We Ever Learn, about the need for more rigorous impact evaluation and learning therefrom in the aid business. So we'll hear from Carola and then Frank and then Ruth for about 5 minutes each.
There you go. I don't know how to read. So, good afternoon, everyone. First, let me thank our host for inviting me and my organization to this book review. Thank you.
Thank you.
Second, let me start my comments by saying that I found this book accomplished very well the results that it tried to achieve, even though I don't have a randomized trial to prove it. It seems that a lot of your mom's friends work at my institution, and so I find it very useful to kind of have a conversation with some of my colleagues that are not so interested in evaluation, but they are interested and they're very committed to their development work. So I think you from a practitioner's point of view, you have accomplished that objective of the book in general. But I think it has done a lot more, and I want to share with you my own personal takeaways. Beyond what the book has kind of led the reader to conclude that are the takeaways from the book, and I think you can think about these are maybe as spillover effects, but I think they're very relevant, and I think that you're speaking to more than your mom's friends, because I found it very relevant myself. So let me say the first takeaway that I have is that I was reading the other night and I caught this phrase, and it said, odds are you don't work for an aid organization, not me, and you most likely won't be called upon to design and deliver a development program. And so I was like, I'm reading this book and I am this person, right? So what is this book saying to me? And it made me think a lot about the Inter-American Development Bank, where I worked for many years. And so fortunately I do work for an international organization, and I wake up every morning thinking how those $12 billion that we put out every year are going to have some relevance and some effectiveness and impact on the ground, right? Like every other part of my colleagues. And so I think the first takeaway for me from this book is that it's not just for the individuals that will donate in Whole Foods, but it's more important, or just as important for us, the larger organizations. Are we talking the talk and walking the walk? And how are we going to be measuring, how are we going to be benchmarked against one another for doing this, right? So I think organizations that innovate and innovate thoughtfully, testing their ideas rigorously. That's what we have to become. And so I think those that achieve that better should deserve more support than others. And I think that we need to step up to that plate. So that's my first takeaway. So the second point that I found very interesting, and it didn't get into your takeaways, so I want to highlight it today, is that you say at the beginning of the book, actually, that finding the things that work to fight poverty is the first step. Making those things enticing is the second. And you don't go too much into about how we think about the incentives we built into the design of our programs and the marketing of the results that we're trying to achieve with the programs. And so I think that was my second takeaway from the book. That was, kind of hidden in there, but really relevant for our work as an international organization. I think also for those of you that know me, I am a self-confessed randomista, right? Ruth in 1998 was my quality reviewer at the IDB when I designed the first random trial with Paul Gertler in Honduras. And so I've been working and really believing in being really rigorous about measuring your results for a long time. But today, I run a whole division of evaluators, and I find myself reminding them of the words that your advisor said to you. This is what I found really important. What matters is the question and the credibility with which you can answer it. Now I'm in a position where I run this division, and somehow a lot of the times the people that work with me have forgotten the first part. That the innovation and the question, it's what drives the evaluation. They're kind of, if it moves, let's evaluate it, right? So I think you say innovation without evaluation does not help the world much as innovation with evaluation. And I would add, evaluation without innovation does not help much either. So that's my third takeaway. You have to think about what it is that you're trying to answer and how you're innovating the solution, not just testing the result. And finally, I think, for us, for big organizations, we need to think about how we turn around our organizations into better behavior or more altruistic behavior. How do we bring in more rigorous evaluations into our organization? And this is something I've been working on, and my colleagues also have been working on very, very hard in their institutions. And I think that's maybe why I invited us here. And I was reminded of Lance Pritchett's paper on why it pays to be ignorant, right? And when we do our internal trainings, that's our first reading. Let's think about why we don't want to do randomized trials, or why don't we want to do evaluations? Because we're really committed and convinced that the things we're doing are really will get the results that we expect, right? So it's not a lack of caring or a lack of commitment with the development world. And I think we need to work with that, and behavioral economics can bring us a lot of solutions or ideas in that realm, and that we need to work with that. I share with Frank a lot of, how can we do this better? What are you guys doing? What are we doing? But I think, we have dealt in incentives within our institution to try to create the incentives for people to do more rigorous impact evaluation. This year, we had about 30% of our lending in 1 year had some sort of rigorous impact evaluation. And that's that's even counting, the big infrastructure projects. And the big infrastructure projects guys go, I can't randomize the dam. What do I do? Let's do a good cost-benefit analysis, right? So it creates kind of this discussion about what is a rigorous method to measure the results from what I'm trying to achieve in development. So I thank you very much for having taken the time to writing this book. We're going to use it a lot. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me here. It's a real honor and to have the opportunity to share the panel here with Dean and Carola and Ruth. I had this weird feeling while Jacob was relating Kara's story that, as a donor, sometimes I feel like we're Kara. We're pushing the text button. It's not our money, right? And it's very easy. And boy, you hate it when the bill comes at the end of the month. let me start. It's interesting. I was in Cambridge earlier this week. For those of you from IPA in Yale, Cambridge is a small town up north where kind of known for its kind of strong community college. And I was with a group of friends, but some people I knew, some I didn't, and somebody at my table said, and I mean, not knowing my background at all, said, this randomized controlled trial, it's just a disaster. And I said, really? Go on, explain. And he said, every PhD econ student now feels like they have to have some kind of randomization to prove anything. Right? And it's undermining all of economics. Now, if I had heard your comments, I would have slapped him. I didn't know that was the appropriate response, right? But I'll keep that in mind for the future. But of course, as Dean said, that's certainly not true, right? I mean, it's certainly, first of all, it's certainly not true that every PhD economist is doing that. That's probably a bit of an exaggeration. It is good news if a lot of them are, because it means that we will have increased capacity to do this kind of work, and I think everybody agrees we need to be doing more of this. And to the extent that we have foreign students in our PhD econ programs, it means that this is going to increasingly be driven by people from their own country, from the local context, which I hope will also undermine a little bit this argument that it's an externally imposed kind of system that doesn't fit the local culture. So I think, like I said, I think there's good news out there that, in fact, a lot of economists are learning this, and that means we'll have more capacity going forward. I too enjoyed the book, and is one that I would like to send to my mother too, who I think still doesn't know what I do. But let me quote one of my favorite parts. Very early on in the book, it said, "You might think that foreign aid organizations have always routinely conducted careful and rigorous evaluations. If so, you would be surprised." And I love that. I mean, I think that's an understatement. I would say, you ought to be taken aback or perhaps shocked that foreign aid agencies have worked for so long doing certain things. And I think with a general sense of unease that a lot of what we've been doing has not been working, without formally trying to address that learning problem. I think that Ruth will talk about that a little bit more, whether we've gotten to the point of where we're learning now. And I think that what Carola said, given that at the IDB they already have 30% of their portfolio that has some form of rigorous evaluations attached to it. MCC is at 50%, and doing more. I'm sorry, I didn't mean that as a one-upsmanship. I think that either of those numbers is worthy of great pride when compared to a lot of the other aid agencies. Certainly a lot of the bilateral aid agencies who could do more and are not, and for the others in the space who find it a challenge based on resources, based on size, and simply don't feel up to it. But like I said, I think that there should be a sense of shock to the extent that we recognize that we have a responsibility to make sure that our work is as effective as possible. This has to become a larger part of our practice. Let me give an example. And so one of the things that I find when I hear Dean talk, when I hear others in the academic world, the notion of learning and the role of using randomized control trials or experimental or quasi-experimental design to learn, that's gained a lot of currency, and I think that's fantastic. It's also in some sense easy. Whether you're a donor agency or whether you are government, where you don't know what the right thing to do is, learning is something that is relatively easy to structure. You can vary treatment, and you can think about it in very creative ways. And I always love hanging out with the people who do this work because they are so smart. I think they're also humble, which is amazing. They're humble in the sense that they start with the premise that they don't know until they can prove to themselves otherwise, which is remarkably refreshing when one works in a different kind of institution. It's one of those things where you start with that premise, and learning is easy. When you work in an aid agency that does large programs, there's another element. and it's not talked about often enough, and that's the notion of accountability. And that is where large programs are already funded. And you can define large however you like, whether it's $2,000 for care or whether it's $20 million for a large donor. If you are spending that money on the premise that it will work, you have an obligation to demonstrate that in fact has worked. And that's not a learning agenda, that is an accountability agenda. That's saying I took somebody's $20 million and I spent it in a certain way and I can demonstrate it had the effect that it had. Now you will also learn from that, don't get me wrong. But it is a fundamentally different thing when you're talking about $20 million than when you have an experiment working with a small number of communities. And that accountability aspect is very difficult within donor agencies, and politically it's understandable because there's very low tolerance for failure when you're spending that kind of money. My point being, I think that the randomistas, the RCT folks, and I support the use of rigorous evaluation methods in evaluation. I think we need to acknowledge that there's an accountability function that needs to be employed, and we need to be willing, in some sense, to not be always the popular people doing, proving cool new ideas, but actually learning through the demonstration of when things worked and when things haven't. I think we have an obligation to the people who give us the money, that's the taxpayers, but we also have an obligation to the beneficiaries. Like I said, at MCC, we take that very seriously, and we try to be as humble as we can and learn from those who can bring methods to these questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's really a pleasure to have been invited, and as David, I think, said, I'm in the process of moving my family to the West Coast, and so I'm grateful for the opportunity to leave my moving activities at home for the day, and Dean always provides an out-of-the-box experience, and so that's what I'm getting today, out of the boxes. The book really is about sort of two domains, I think. One is around evaluation, and the other is around behavioral economics. And we often see these two things together, and it's sort of interesting that they are often seen together. And I think that the people who are attracted to looking at applications of behavioral economics in development and maybe in domestic spheres as well are people who are not overly enraptured by theory from books, and instead trust what they see with their own eyes and trust the facts on the ground and empiricism deeply, and so are simultaneously attracted to strong ways to learn about and from the facts on the ground. So I'm going to say two things about evaluation and two things about behavioral economics, and with deep gratitude for this book now being in the world so that we can all read it and share it with either people like Dean's mom or people like Carola's colleagues or anybody else. On evaluation, I think the book does a terrific job of explaining the value and giving concrete examples of where impact evaluations and particularly randomized control trials have been done. Very accessible, and I think mirrors a lot of the progress that's been made in the field. Carola and Frank referred to the really tremendous work that their own institutions have done. I've recently left USAID, where there's great interest and increasing use of impact evaluation methods for both learning and accountability purposes. And I see at least one of my former colleagues here as well. So a lot of progress in creating the space within large organizations for doing evaluations and in attention to the relevance of the questions that are being asked. So it's not just kind of randomize whenever you can, but ask the questions, find the methods that are appropriate and feasible, and then use the findings to inform future program design. So I do think that that is in clear evidence in some organizations, and really the MCC deserves tremendous credit in this realm, and very much on the upswing in many others. I think the book wasn't its intent, but it doesn't belabor any points, let's put it that way, about the limitations of the practice of randomization, except to say that when the groups participating, the implementers participating in evaluations don't want the evaluations to occur. They can throw up all sorts of roadblocks. Well, that's one sentence in the book, but it says a lot and probably could have been explored a bit more. I'm sure you have many interesting stories in that regard. The second point I want to make about, so I was missing a little bit of that flavor of how hard doing these evaluations really is and how special the skills are that are needed to negotiate that practice. Second point I want to make about evaluation is has to do with the use of the word proven. So in my mind, evaluation is a tool for searching. It is a tool for trying to find how well something works compared to expectations or compared to some other way of doing business. To then suddenly slap on the label of something being proven stops the search, or has the possibility of stopping the search. And certainly in the policy community, which has a shorter attention span perhaps than Dean, when an intervention is labeled as proven, the search really does stop. And that sort of pulls resources, pulls attention. And so I guess I'd caution a little bit against overusing that idea of proof. And I think it's also the case that there's a sense that when an evaluation is yields positive findings, that somehow that equates with large impact. So it doesn't always, right? You can have consistent, predictable, proven, small impact. And so I think, again, sort of being very transparent about what the magnitude of impact is, as well as how strong our evidence is about it. So those are my little quibbles about the evaluation piece. And then on the behavioral economics theme that pervades this book and at least one other that's recently been issued, that has a set of acknowledgments very similar to yours. It's a club. It's a wonderful club that you're a part of. A couple of points on the behavioral economics. I think that it's an extremely exciting development among the contemporary economics profession, as Frank was suggesting. I think it would be wonderful if those who are engaged in behavioral economics open the doors a little bit more to the insights from a long tradition of marketing, of psychology, of many different sort of disciplines that have preceded this current interest in behavioral economics and that have a lot to offer. I think there are a lot of inspirations that come from that, and maybe opening the door to the people who are practitioners a little bit wider. So, for example, IDEO in San Francisco, who are kind of marketing anthropologists, have a huge amount to offer, I think, to the field. Last point on behavioral economics is I was sort of craving in this book something that I almost got and didn't quite, which is, what are the big public policy ideas here? Is the core message, it all depends on the mechanism design, on exactly what is going on in a particular program and all the little nuances, and we should focus all of our attention there? Or are there some big public policy messages a la conditional cash transfers, which I think of as kind of, a real breakthrough? So I just wasn't quite sure, and in contrast to the book Nudge, which laid out a whole list of, here are some ways that behavioral economics could be applied to big public policy questions. I didn't quite feel that, and so maybe that could be your next assignment. So with that probably unfair tour around the edges of the book and not quite within the book, I just want to say again, thank you for writing it, and we look forward to whatever comes next.
So we're going to have question and answer from the audience. I think I will